Groups are a key part of social psychology, so it's really useful for us to start our discussion on social psychology for the A-Level syllabus with what is a group. I've picked out two definitions of a group from sociologists from the 1950s that I think can still be really useful to us to start to identify what a group is before we can start to think about how does someone become a part of it. So the first definition that I've picked out is from a psychologist called R.F. Bales from 1950, and he says this: each member receives some impression or perception of each other member distinct enough so that he or she can give some reaction to each of the others as an individual person. Therefore, if somebody has to recognise every other member of the group individually, you would think that there would be an upper group size, which might be about 30 people, a classroom's worth, rather than a school assembly that's not a group anymore, according to this idea from Bales. What about a lower limit? Well, also from 1950, German sociologist Georg Simmel says that in marriage, the decisive difference is between monogamy and bigamy, whereas the third or 20th wife is relatively unimportant for the marriage structure. So we've got this idea that a group seems to be somewhere between 3 and 30 would be a practical group. These are from 1950. There was no such thing as the internet, there was no such thing as social media, virtual groups did not exist, and so there's a huge area of development that we can now discuss that says, well, is this still the case? And arguably it still is, maybe it isn't. That's totally up to you. And that's the fun of psychology. There's still so many unanswered points that you get the fun of putting forward your own case, so long as you're using references to then back up. I got this idea based on this. I got this idea based on this. Throwing them together, I now think this. Let's look at what a defining characteristic of a group is. I'd argue there are two: self-perception and interaction. The self-perception part is easy. Members have to perceive the group as real, and they have to perceive themselves as a part of it. Whatever it might be, whether it's a member of your local rugby club. Do you perceive it to be real? Well, you meet every Saturday and you play rugby, so yeah. And do you go and do it? Yeah. So you're a member of the rugby club. Second part is interaction. Members of a group must interact with each other because members are mutually influencing and interdependent. Whether that comes from an authoritarian person at the top giving the instructions, or whether it democratically and organically evolves, that really doesn't matter at this stage. But you have to interact with the other members of the group to be able to develop that commonality. And so what is that area of commonality? How can we define that? Well, arguably there are four categories that we can think about in this area, which would be shared goals. Group members work towards something in common. The second part might be internal norms. There are norms of behaviours within the group that don't exist outside of the group. Think about that rugby club. It's normal in that rugby club to enter into a scrum. However, if you did that in a supermarket, you'd be looked upon as quite odd. Within a group, you have distinct roles. Not only are you a player on the rugby club, you might be the team captain. You might be the winger, you might be the scrum. There's all different elements of the team, elements of the group, which have distinct roles. You play your part for the team. And the final part will be affective relations. What does this mean? It means feelings, emotions. You're unlikely to be totally ambivalent to other members of your group. You're likely to have some sort of feeling. Whether that's positive or negative is by the by, but membership of that group will evoke some feelings from you. And when a member accepts those norms of a group, they're said to be conforming. Now, conformity is a concept that can be broken down into three elements, and these three are internalisation, identification, and compliance. Well, identification we've already sort of brushed upon in terms of the self-perception and identifying as a member of a group. Let's look at internalisation and compliance now, and let's look at them with reference to a couple of studies. The first one, we're going to look at internalisation with Sherif from 1935. I love this study of the autokinetic effect, and it really shows how a group can influence somebody to internalise an idea and take it with them even when the other group members aren't there. The autokinetic effect is an illusion of light that moves when it's not really moving, because in a darkened room with one pinprick of light, there's no reference points to really judge if it has or it hasn't moved. participants were asked to judge the movement of the light, in the first instance they're asked on their own, and they guess, and they're as right or wrong as anybody else. They're then put into a second condition where they're in a group, and what happens here, which is very interesting, is that the ideas that each person brings, I think it moves 2 inches, I think it moves 1 inch, I think it moves half an inch, they converge and they develop this new group norm. The most interesting part of this experiment is that the third stage of it is that Sherif takes the participants back again into a private situation and asks them again, how much do you think that light moved? And the participants maintain the group norm. Even though the other group members aren't there anymore, they still maintain that group norm. That is internalization. They've internalized whatever the group norm developed into. Now there's another idea that comes from the work of Solomon Asch, 1951, his famous paradigm of the lines study. And this is to do with compliance with the majority. It's not internalizing it, it's just changing a public behavior. Participants were shown 3 lines and asked which matched with the comparison line. In private, they were able to answer it perfectly accurately. But in public, when they were set with some other participants who were actually stooges and were all told to give the wrong answer, and the same wrong answer, suddenly 1/3 of Asch's participants started to give the wrong answer too. But when they were taken back out of that group situation and into a private situation again, they gave the correct answer. Not the group norm, but the one they knew to be correct all along. So what's just happened? These people, these 1/3 of participants, have complied publicly with a group norm, but they haven't internalized it. But for some reason they decided they would rather be right by the group than right by the actual accurate answer. It is worth noting that Asch's study only showed that 1/3 of participants complied publicly to the norm. 2/3 maintained their private opinions and saw that the rest of the group was wrong and felt no need to comply. But it's still an interesting result that 1/3 of people in a totally unambiguous situation decided that they would rather give the wrong answer but be in with the group than the other way around.